everyone, welcome to Logan's Mosh Pit. Glad to have you here. Do me a favor and please subscribe if you haven't already. Let's launch into a new episode of Rock and Read. Today you will get to hear Chapter 17 of the Tom Petty biography. Chapter 17 is called Tour with Bob Dylan. Here we go. Dave Stewart convinced Petty to bring a horn section and backup singers on the road when the Heartbreakers went out to support Southern Accents. It was another decision that would be talked about with some regret just a few years later. There were those who could only see Tom Petty as a meat and potatoes rock and roller. Petty had already released a major single that didn't simply use a drum machine, it featured a drum machine. To those who wanted him to stick closer to the rock and roll formula, the brass and the singers of the Southern Accents tour felt like something from The Tonight Show. Horns had been a staple before R&B was called rock and roll, but the British invasion made the four-piece an institution. It was fun at the time, says Mike Campbell. We did it. We survived. The live album that was released that year, Pack Up the Plantation, mixed the big band Heartbreakers of that tour with some older cuts. The WBCN live recording from 1978, which had traveled widely as a bootleg, provided Don't Bring Me Down, the Goffin Kings song made famous by the Animals. Rebels and Southern Accents made the collection, but the notable absence of any other songs from Southern Accents was the giveaway that this live album was much more a career retrospective than a tour souvenir. The point Pack Up the Plantation made that the Heartbreakers were one of rock and roll's best live acts seemed to be generally accepted by the critics. The fans had always known it. The closing track on the collection, the album's emotional center, was a cover of John Sebastian's Stories We Could Tell. It's a simple thing, tossed off as much as the Heartbreakers tossed off anything. Petty strums a loose acoustic guitar. The Fabulous Poodles' Bobby Valentino provides fiddle accompaniment, and Stan Lynch sings a harmony. But it's the best version of a song recorded by a number of acts, the Everly Brothers among them. It shows a side of the Heartbreakers that doesn't always get the spotlight, that comes out in originals like Mystery Man and No Second Thoughts. And it's a song that takes as its subject the melancholy of a life spent making live music, sitting on the edge of hotel beds, playing something before going out to play something more. Stories We Could Tell is a meditation on what compels a person to give up so much in exchange for a life that's a mix of monotony and transcendence in unequal proportions. For touring musicians, the song is a reminder of why you do it, and Petty himself needed the reminder. Don't Come Around Here No More allowed certain among Petty's critics another reason to give him good, but not great grades. Every review Robert Christgau ever wrote on Tom Petty gave with one hand and took back with the other. It had begun to seem that if the Heartbreakers' string of hits filled the arenas, the same chart success made the band vulnerable to critical backlash. Neil Young didn't move a lot of units when he released Landing on Water, but his seeming disregard for the marketplace got him points with critics. Young had earned some freedoms. He could pay the bills with Harvest when Trans didn't move at the record stores. Much of his audience was already comfortable paying little attention to his latest release. Most of them wanted Old Man. For Petty, the situation was different. He was still building a legacy, and he never wanted to think of a release as something people accepted but didn't celebrate. Still, as early as the band's third album, Petty was frustrated with the downside of hits. I remember one of the most heartbreaking things was going to the Whiskey right after Damn the Torpedoes had come out, Petty says. Everybody treated us different, almost like we were sellouts or something. There was that vibe. We had a hit. A hit. It was as if they were couching it as this integrity versus popularity thing. But I wanted to have hits. That was the point. Jerry Lee Lewis had hits. I didn't want to not get the music out there. In 2002, Billboard named Petty the all-time leader on the mainstream rock charts with 46 chart appearances. That kind of thing was good news. But some people looked askance at the artists who were too regular in their visits to the charts. Some of that goes on to this very day, Petty says with a shrug. It just matters less. But back then, it bothered me. A lot. A collaboration with an artist like Bob Dylan would put Petty in the company of a man who had set up a very productive shop at some distance from the Billboard charts. Dylan was another teacher who showed up when Petty needed him. Tom Petty had met Bob Dylan before. With only 2 albums out, Petty had gone to see Dylan play at the Universal Amphitheater, and Dylan, much to Petty's surprise, had introduced the younger artist from the stage. Why he did that? Petty didn't know. But by 1985, they had become closer still, sharing a manager in Elliot Roberts. When Tony Demetrius joined up with Roberts, Petty was on a roster that included Joni Mitchell, Neil Young, Devo, The Cars, and Bob Dylan. In that regard, he was close to Dylan, which made him almost as close as anyone else. At Live Aid, Petty had watched from the side of the stage as Dylan, introduced by Jack Nicholson, walked out with Keith Richards and Ronnie Wood for a forgettable, sloppy performance. Some would say that it was just what Live Aid deserved. For all its noble intentions, Live Aid carried within it all the hubris and bloat of the mega event. But in the midst of that unfocused performance between songs, Dylan made a passing comment that, for most among the massive audience, drifted unnoticed into the nighttime air. I'd like to say that I hope that some of the money that's raised for the people in Africa, maybe they can take just a little bit of it, maybe 1 or 2 million maybe, and use it to pay the mortgages on some of the farms, what the farmers here owe to the banks. Dylan's words worked their way into Willie Nelson's reefer-infused but agile mind, and as a result, brought about the launch of Farm Aid. Nelson, Neil Young, and John Mellencamp took the lead in putting the event together, and as spiritual father to the idea, Dylan almost had to show. Perhaps, because of Dylan's sloppy Live Aid performance, Petty got a call from Elliot Roberts asking if the Heartbreakers would back Dylan at Farm Aid. When I came up with the Dylan-Petty thing, that was just a dream I had, Elliot Roberts explains. I told Tony that I wanted to put Tom with Bob, then called Tom and said, I have this great idea. Tom tells me he'd kill to do this. So I tell Bob, hey, Tom's willing to do this, to be your band, and not charge you anything. Not charge anything? It wasn't quite like that, Tony Demetrius says. For Farm Aid, possibly. We might have done that for expenses only, but we weren't going to go out on the road without meeting our needs. Dylan meant an enormous amount to all of us. He was and is a giant in our collective estimation, but as manager, I didn't leave the practical dimension out of consideration. Dylan's Farm Aid performance, while loose, was transcendent when compared to that of Live Aid. Because Petty was untethered from the microphone, he got to play some lead guitar and smoke more cigarettes. Ben Montench was smiling. Dylan even smiled. Bob really liked Tom a lot, says Roberts. He thought he was a great player and a great singer, had great songs. So following Farm Aid, the idea of a tour came up. After confirming the dates with Dylan, however, Petty had second thoughts about it all. He was feeling less comfortable about leaving his kids at home. Things had gotten worse in Encino for everyone. Without knowing just what he was dealing with, blaming it on the drugs, Petty was watching his wife come apart. She was losing a fight with a mental illness. It took Stevie Nicks to push him to follow through. Tom was sitting there on the chair at his house, Nicks remembers, and he says, I'm not going. I told him, oh, yes, you are going. You can't cancel on Bob Dylan? What? You're going to call Bob and tell him it's off? Tom just goes, I'm not doing it. Okay, I say. Why? He tells me, because Jane won't go. Now, this is where the Floridian parts of these people really come out. I said I was going to talk to Jane, but he insists that she's not interested, just doesn't want to go. So I turn around and say, well, do you want me to go? Do you need a sidekick? Is that what you're saying? Someone to be with you and to make you laugh? And to be there when you're lonely? This is obviously the thing that is scaring you on this tour. And you're not afraid of anything. You're not afraid of alligators. What the... You know? By Nix's account, she didn't get a response out of Petty, but that mattered less to her than getting an answer out of his wife. I had only rarely taken Jane on tour, Petty says, so I don't know why I would have said I wouldn't go without her. I was probably throwing a fit. That kind of thing happened. But that tour, having Stevie along, was very good for me. It changed the channel. Stevie was light-hearted, and she so loved music. She figured out before I did that we had a blend as singers. She'd come over and the guitars would come, and we'd sing old songs, and it could sound so good. But right then, she also knew, probably better than most people, that I was in a really delicate mental spot. I was just shattered emotionally. I was just going back and forth from one extreme to another every day, completely freaked out. She kept me focused on what I had to do, where I had to show up, got me on stage. Stevie Nicks had a bond with Jane Petty. Nix's song title, Edge of 17, inadvertently came from Jane. When they were first getting to know each other, Jane Petty was telling Nix the story of the early days in Gainesville, how she met her husband at the age of 17, which filtered through her North Florida accent, sounded like the edge of 17. What Nix heard had the right poetic resonance. It didn't hurt their friendship that they both loved cocaine, and Nix kept her inventory in good supply. Nix played the go-between with Tom and Jane. I said to Jane, "He's not going to go without you. Do you want this tour to be canceled?" And she said, "He can't do this. He's Tom Petty. He's perfectly capable of going on the road and backing up Bob Dylan. He made this decision. He's a grown man." I looked at her and said, "Well, he's not going without you, so do you want me to go for you?" "Sure," she tells me, "you go." So I marched upstairs and told Tommy, "Guess what? I'm your wingman. So I'm going to get my passport and get my assistant Rebecca, and we'll meet you at the airport." He said okay, and off we went. "Not exactly," says Petty. "There was this moment when Jane went to Stevie and said, 'I want you to go to Australia and keep an eye on Tommy.' I found it kind of unusual, but not that unusual. I had heard her say this to people before, you know. Take him away and keep him involved. Basically, so she could party on her own without any supervision. I had limits as to what I thought was appropriate. I thought, yeah, that sounds good to me." It was weird times. I remember going over to Stevie's house and talking about it, and she needed to get her passport renewed real fast or something. But we did it. And we really got to know each other better on that trip. Everybody liked Stevie. She was just part of the entourage. I mean, we weren't a couple or anything. The press saw it otherwise. Stevie Nicks had a single out and should have been home supporting it. The David Letterman show was calling her manager, Irving Azoff, asking for her to perform on the show, unable to grasp why an artist would release a single and then disappear. Letterman wanted me to come on to sing "I Can't Wait," Nicks explains, but I was gone, out of touch with the world. It got into the papers, and they got pissed. And I'm in Australia with Tom Petty and Bob Dylan, having a great time, oblivious. This is how important Tom Petty and the Heartbreakers are to me. I was completely willing to get in the way of my own single. When Dylan waved to her from the stage at an early show, Nicks didn't think to do more than wave back. But he was signaling her to join them on stage, which she did, and she would have for the whole tour, but for the fact that she had no work permit. But it was no matter. She hadn't come with the intention of performing, and was happy at the side of the stage. The connection Petty felt with Nicks would carry them for years, though it had its own volatilities. She got really mad at me one night in Australia, says Petty. We were talking about Fleetwood Mac, something about the band, and I said, "Yeah, but the Heartbreakers are a rock and roll band." She kind of lost her mind, saying, "I'm in a rock and roll band." "Not really," I told her. And she said, "How dare you say that to me?" And this long debate ensued about how you get these credentials. And I love that band, have the greatest respect for Lindsay and Mick, but I didn't see them as a rock and roll band. I thought her journey was different from mine. There was a rub, like I didn't always agree with her musical taste, and she didn't always agree with mine. My frustration with her was, you need somebody to remind you what you're capable of. You get too easily distracted by bullers that want to make a hit. I don't know why you're doing all this synthesizer rock. I was probably in hole when I think about it, but I felt free enough with her that I could do that. When told that he and Nick certainly sound like a couple, Petty appears to be a man who can't argue that point. Well, he says, we were close. We were never what you'd call an item, but we certainly had our times. When the subject of Bob Dylan comes up among the Heartbreakers in their camp, no one says a whole lot, beyond stating their love and admiration. Mostly, it's the safe stuff. Respect for Dylan among those who have worked for him or still do is shown in the silence that follows the mention of his name. No one interferes with the mystery around Dylan, which may be his greatest creation. When asked what Dylan was going through during the tours with the Heartbreakers, a period Dylan writes about in great detail in the Chronicles, Elliot Roberts says, that was unique to Bob, going through that. I don't really like to talk about him, frankly. I'm still good friends with him, and that's probably why. But those passages in Chronicles are quite remarkable. Dylan describes being at some kind of creative low, lost as the tour moves sluggishly toward its last weeks. I've been on an 18-month tour with Tom Petty and the Heartbreakers. It would be my last. I had no connection to any kind of inspiration. Whatever was there to begin with had all but vanished and shrunk. Tom was at the top of his game, and I was at the bottom of mine. I couldn't overcome the odds. Everything was smashed. My own songs had become strangers to me. I didn't have the skill to touch their raw nerves. Couldn't penetrate their surfaces. It wasn't my moment of history anymore. There was a hollow stinging in my heart, and I couldn't wait to retire and fold the tent. One more big payday with Tom Petty, and that would be it for me. I was what they called over the hill. If I wasn't careful, I would end up ranting and raving and shouting matches with the wall. The mirror had swung around and I could see the future. An old actor fumbling in garbage cans outside the theater of his past triumphs. Dylan's description of what came next relies on a language and imagery that suggests nothing short of a conversion experience. It's stuff that recalls Tolstoy's Ivan Ilyich on his deathbed. A sudden psychic and spiritual shift, an epiphany as much of the body as the mind, an opening onto the next part of his creative life, and immediate awareness of its significance. It happened on stage at a show with the Heartbreakers in Locarno, Switzerland. Everything came back, and it came back in multi-dimension. Even I was surprised. It left me kind of shaky. Immediately I was flying high. This new thing had taken place right in front of everybody's eyes. The difference in energy might have been perceived, but that was about all. Nobody would have noticed that a metamorphosis had taken place. By all accounts, most of the Heartbreakers didn't notice, with the exception of Petty. I remember seeing that, he says. I remember having a shock when he went to sing, and nothing came out. He just kind of took a deep breath and came back, full-voiced. The other Heartbreakers were more likely wondering what key the next song would be in. Bob's performances are what he lives for, Elliot Roberts says. His whole day is based on 8 o'clock. I don't know if that's how people can relate to him now, but in those days, that's how it was. Every show, didn't matter if it was Cincinnati or L.A. Talking with Bud Scapa for a Cream feature in 1987, Petty describes the rehearsals themselves as being particularly stimulating. But more than the tour, I think it was the rehearsals for the tour that inspired us, Petty adds. They were long rehearsals, 5 hours sometimes, where we played 100 songs in a night. We played so many songs every night, it was really inspiring. Because Bob was excited. Everybody was excited. We were just having a great time. And then, when we started realizing how to drive that thing, we really started getting excited. Among the band members, the Dylan tour registered differently. If they all agree without reservation that the experience took them to the next level as a band, then not knowing how a song might be played, what key it would be in, what feel, wore on them differently. Ben Montench, as Dylan points out in Chronicles, wanted to explore Dylan's catalog with him. The spontaneity, the almost careening beauty, engaged the keyboard player. Petty, too, felt like he was learning something about what it meant to approach songs as Dylan had learned too early on. Dylan's relationship to his material reflected something that had become rare in the pop tradition. Bob works in the way a true folk singer works, Petty insists. He can drop sections, make changes on the spot. It's part of the very idea of folk music. On stage, I felt like he had the same spontaneity of a great jazz player. The Heartbreakers would be talking about what they saw up there from that point forward in their lives as musicians. Dylan's spontaneity wasn't restricted to the stage. There was something to be learned from him in that regard, too. At one of the first rehearsals, even before full production, Dylan showed up late. The band was only able to rehearse some 90 minutes before Stan Lynch let Petty know that he had to leave. Tom was like, "Where do you need me to be?" says Lynch, and I told him, "I'm going to see Frank and Sammy tonight at the Greek." The whole band just starts backing away from me. I mean, literally, it was like, we don't know him. This might have even been the first rehearsal. Bob got his shades on, kind of noticing the conversation, but not a part of it. 2 minutes later, Bob says, "Frank and Sammy?" The room's still dead quiet. "I love those guys," he said. I go, "Well, I have 2 tickets, 4th row, and I don't have a date." Lynch and Dylan left in the drummer's Jaguar XJS, a 12-cylinder 2-seater. There wasn't room for Dylan to bring security. "I thought Stan was getting brownie points with the new boss," says Mike Campbell. "I was kind of jealous." Stan Lynch had seen Sammy Davis Jr. several times in Las Vegas, had what he referred to as a Sammy Museum in his house. He knew much more about Sammy Davis Jr., in fact, than he did about Bob Dylan. I wasn't really sucked into the whole vortex of Dylan mythology yet, says Lynch. Bob Dylan was to me this guy who was really cool, and all along the Watchtower is a great Hendrix record. I'm still that stupid. So I'm trying to strike up conversation with Bob Dylan, and it's going pretty well. "So, you think this tour will go out on the road?" I ask. "Yeah, we'll go out on the road," he says. "Where do you think we'll go?" I ask. "We'll probably go all over," he says. "Do you like having a band?" "Yeah, it's fun having a band." "Right? He's just a guy." Then we get to the Greek Theater and he tightens his sweatshirt hood around his face. We make our way to the 4th row. He looks like the Unabomber. But by that point, a few people are realizing that Bob Dylan is there. You can sort of feel the energy. The show starts and it's great. But I kind of got one eye on Bob, one eye on Sammy. Like, how's Bob reacting to this? How's Bob reacting to me loving Sammy so much? What's happening here? The whole thing is odd, with the people around us reacting to how Bob is reacting to Sammy. At the end of the set, after a standing ovation, Dylan made to leave. Perhaps all the talk about Sammy Davis Jr. had confused things. Lynch, not knowing what else to do, grabbed Dylan by the back of his sweatshirt as he started heading toward the aisle, reminding him that Frank was still due to perform. "But now it's intermission," says Lynch, and I'm pressed for more conversation. Then Cheryl Teagues, the supermodel, walks by, and it's a perfect opener. She's hot. Musicians can only talk about a few things, right? I go, "Cheryl Teagues, man." He goes, "Huh? Who?" I say, "Right there in front of you." I say something like, "Nice ass." And this is where I knew we were going to be friends. He says, "That's way after my time." I go, "What?" He says to me, "I like Anne Margaret, Elizabeth Taylor." He starts naming chicks like that. I say, "Really?" He looks at me, takes his sunglasses off, and says, "Really?" I finally start catching on, like, right, Bob Dylan, Life magazine, and I'm in another league tonight. No one in the Heartbreakers went away from working with Dylan without feeling like they had been to the very best school. Dylan's relationship to the song affected everyone else's, but like most of the men who came into Petty's life, Dylan didn't have a band in the way Petty did. Dylan had road bands and studio bands, and some that stayed with him for long periods, but Dylan was a solo artist who brought players in. As band leaders, the two men had different job descriptions. Petty was a member of a group, even if he was struggling to remain one. I remember one night on the Dylan tour, says Petty, getting into an argument with Stan on stage. I don't even know what it was about anymore. We were doing the Heartbreakers section of the show. I looked at him, not to communicate something, just looked at him for some reason, and he took his drumstick in one hand and just shot me the bird, mouthed the words, "You." I don't know what it was, but something about it made me so mad. I went into a rage. Just pushed my guitar off, walked from the stage, shut myself in the dressing room, sitting there, too angry to talk. Petty told the managers to go away, said that everyone needed to stay out. It caused obvious concern among the production team. On stage, the Heartbreakers kept playing. Petty could hear as Al Cooper got up and started jamming with the band, a blues thing. Finally, says Petty, the door opens, and it's Bob. He comes in and goes, "Hey man, I heard you got mad. Don't be mad. Let's go back and play." I was so angry. I said, "Stan gets," but Bob stopped me and said, No, don't go there. Everything's okay. John Lee Hooker's here. We're going to play with John Lee Hooker. Come on, you don't want to miss that. Let's go play." So I went with Bob and John Lee Hooker, went up and finished the set. But Stan, he has the power to get under my skin. I don't only want to knock him because he was a tremendous part of our success, but he could get under my skin. Between Petty and Stan Lynch, though, there was still Mike Campbell, Petty's number 2. For a long time, Campbell had been the link, keeping that band from falling apart. Lynch was regularly putting Petty down behind the band leader's back. Petty, for his part, didn't have to say much for Campbell to know how bad it had gotten. Campbell knew, from both sides, but he wouldn't be in the middle for long. After months of touring, the Heartbreakers were deep in a kind of in-betweenness. They weren't entirely themselves, or really, Dylan's. To be Dylan's band was not to experience oneness with the man. You didn't get to move into Dylan's head and take a look around. He had a band, but the show was his, as was his experience of it. As that account in Chronicles more than reinforces, Dylan was somewhat detached, a frontman living in a different hemisphere than his players. Though the Heartbreakers were doing their own set every night, the Dylan part of the show remained an experience so different from their own that at times they were having an almost schizophrenic musical experience. They were working out of somebody else's office, so the pressure was less in some ways, but they were also becoming disassociated from their own program. What Petty finally had to ask himself, what are they really doing? It was a question that came only toward the end of the first Dylan tour, but it was Petty's responsibility to answer it, and making a record was the most obvious way to do that. Given that the Heartbreakers had been out on stage chasing Dylan night after night, Petty chose to let the looseness born of that enter into the process. When they got off the road from the True Confessions tour, with time booked and their gear moved into Sound City, Petty started writing in the studio, calling out chords to his band, not sure himself where he was going. It wasn't how he had worked in the past. On the rough mixes you can hear him barking out the changes, letting intuition carry him. Everybody involved knew that the Dylan tour had heightened the band's capacity to move as a unit, to build something without a blueprint. An already agile group had become something more, a rock and roll outfit as fleet-footed as the great studio bands they had listened to growing up. The album they created had a top 20 hit and went gold without a lot of trouble, but it wasn't the kind of success the band had gotten used to. Petty still says that the title, "Let Me Up, I've Had Enough," is the best part about it, if only because it's fitting. No one is harder on a Heartbreakers record than the Heartbreakers. And not everybody outside the band is in agreement, of course, even if the Heartbreakers lit the funeral pyre on Let Me Up some time ago. There are critics who don't fully understand why everyone would be content to write that album off. Bad sales? That hadn't stopped a slew of other recordings from being viewed as classics. A disjointed collection, Some of the best albums fit that description. The idea that Let Me Up, I've Had Enough was a failure seems to be one of those things that everybody agreed on in haste, moving on before a fair trial could take place. Ben Montench has always suggested that the album's problems stem from the disconnect between Petty's loose, written-in-the-studio approach and the tracks Mike Campbell brought in, meticulously crafted pieces built around programmed drums and layers of overdub, most of it made in isolation, not with the band. Runaway Trains, My Life, Your World, and all mixed up, the Campbell recordings were the opposite end of the spectrum from the Dylan experience. They were tracks built in a studio, not found on a stage. In 1987, on the eve of the tour supporting Let Me Up, I've Had Enough, Tench was already quick to brush aside any compliments that might come on his way regarding the record. "You should hear how good it was when the band played those songs live," he said. "That's how they should be heard." The Heartbreakers contracts didn't say they had to recite these superlatives from the press release when asked about a new record. Some way, the Boys of Summer was still a scent that came into the air. As for the record makers, any occasion on which another recording enters the control room is trouble, whether it's a demo or some previous success, or someone else's previous success. You can bet that there weren't any other recordings crowding the room when the Kingsmen finally put their cover of Louie Louie onto tape. But as for the Heartbreakers, it was difficult to completely ignore the background noise of the Boys of Summer. Of the songs on Let Me Up, Runaway Trains pulls toward that recording more than any other. Not that anyone talked about it that way, but it was the same Mike Campbell who built the Boys of Summer track who created the music for Runaway Trains, and there was little doubt that Petty preferred not to watch one more Mike Campbell demo become another man's hit. As the song evolved, particularly when Petty's vocal went down, it became a Heartbreakers recording. Runaway Trains remains one of the great underrated Petty Campbell songs, largely because Petty's instinct was right. This was a Campbell demo in which he could make a place for himself. He wrote to it as naturally as he did Refugee and Here Comes My Girl. But Petty feels he let everyone down. Usually meticulous, focused, willing to leap off some cliffs, facetious in knowing the inner life of the songs so that he could guide their evolution as recordings, Petty got distracted. For the first time, he moved out of the family house. He got himself an apartment at the Sunset Marquis. He was getting ready to end his marriage. After being there for a few months, however, he got a call from his wife, frantic, saying that Anakim had broken her arm. He rushed back. It wasn't a broken arm, but he didn't have the heart not to stay. There were records that were hard to make, records that got confused, he says, but I was always there to watch them go off the rails. With that album, though, I kind of stepped out to the back alley for a smoke and didn't come back, just as we were finishing recording. I was ready to hand it off. I talked to Ibean, and he felt Mike Shipley could take what we had done and turn it into the record. It was the first time, the only time. I handed a Heartbreakers record over to someone else to bring it home. I shouldn't have. No one knows a record as well as the people who made it. You don't just give it over to someone who wasn't there when it went down. Previously, Shipley had worked with Def Leppard. Well, that's the end of Chapter 17. Let me know what you thought of Chapter 17 in the comments below. That does it for today's video, guys. I hope you enjoyed. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe if you haven't already. I really appreciate the support. I'll see you next time. Till then, rock on.